Hi friends, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Here's what we're discussing today. I made this video this morning, but I decided I should put a preface on it. And so, let me tell you, I watched a little bit of the coverage of the Trump trial in Manhattan. And I have some thoughts on it that you will see in this video, but I wanted to point out that I try always to keep this non-political. So rather than thinking about it as the Trump trial, think about it as if somebody you know, your local mayor, the guy who runs the cash register at the grocery store. Think about if this had happened and if this witness had been brought in to testify against that person. That will help keep it from sounding as political. Unfortunately, because it involves President Trump, people are going to interpret political things out of it anyway, but I have done my best to keep this as politics-free as possible. So this looks at what happens when you put a perjurer on the stand. And with that introduction, we'll run right into what I recorded this morning. They say that fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And I guess maybe I'm a bit of a fool here because I'm going to jump in on the Trump trial. For those of you who have been living in Afghanistan in a cave or under a rock somewhere, the former president has been on trial in New York City for flawed business records, false business records. And at the heart of this was his recordation of a hush money payoff to Stormy Daniels as some kind of legal expense. The linchpin of the entire trial was the testimony of Michael Cohen. Now, for those of you who are interested in a blow-by-blow description of the Michael Cohen direct and cross-examination, which, by the way, lasted for 3 days, you can find it on Robert Gouvea's site. And I would really suggest that you go there because he has nailed it down. He has all of this stuff from a Twitter feed by the name of Inner City Press, who, by the way, is doing the Menendez trial right now. The long and short of it is, I'm not going to go into all of that. I'm going to go into something that I think is perhaps a bit more interesting, which is, what does a lawyer do when he has someone who is a convicted felon and a convicted perjurer, and you have to rely on his testimony in order to make your case? My thought here is that it's interesting from an academic standpoint, but it's also interesting from sort of the inside baseball standpoint. I personally have never had a witness that I had to put on who had been caught in a lie, either in court or, for academic dishonesty or something of that nature. It happens all the time. People lie. It amazed me when I became a lawyer just exactly how much people lie, but they lie quite frequently, and some of them do it very well. I had a employee once when I was in Quincy, Illinois, who was just an amazing liar. And she was quick on her feet, and she always had an answer for something when you would catch her in a lie. And it was amazing. She had a problem where she decided she wanted to take off a weekend. And the deal was, if you took off a weekend, you had to work the next weekend because somebody had to work there, for you during that weekend. So it was only fair. But I had an out for that. And I said, if you actually have a legitimate sick day where you are, going to the doctor or where your kid's in the hospital in the emergency room, you bring me that information, we'll take care of it. So she brought me the information, and she had her story completely down pat. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. Then we went and took my daughter to the ER, and here's the ER paper. Many of you may remember, some of you may not, that for many years people used dot matrix printers, and those dot matrix printers had little perforations on the side, little holes on the side that would could be used to run a form up as it's being printed. So it had all of that in there to go through a printer, and it was filled out by hand. And she even had an explanation for how it was filled out by hand. Something had happened and the computers had gone down and they had to put all this stuff down in pen. This was about 3 weeks into her serial lying, and we could never exactly nail it down. And finally, she gave me this. I said, okay, I'll let you know what my decision is shortly. I jumped in the car and I drove to the other hospital. It was a hospital about 30 miles away. And I talked to them and they said, oh no, that's not an official record from here. Somebody obviously just took a form off of the stack of forms and filled it out by hand. But no, that person was never a patient here. So I went back to her and I told her this, and she said, well, we asked that for privacy reasons that her being a patient there was not to be disclosed to anyone. And I said, well, even so, they say that this form is an absolute forgery and you're fired. There can be people who are very good at lying, and there can be people who are very bad at lying. I believe I mentioned here once that there was a young lady, I think her name was Joanne, that we had in a defamation case. And every time she was caught in a lie, her neck would turn beet red, about the shade of my shirt. And it was a dead giveaway that she was lying. Everybody, or I should say almost everybody, has a tell. Now, pathological liars don't have a tell. That's why they're pathological liars. They've become so good at it that they can fool anybody. When you have a witness who has, for example, a perjury conviction, you want to hope that it's 10 years down the road, and that in that intervening period of time, they've lived a very good life and they've not been in trouble and not done anything wrong. And the very first thing you do when you put them on the stand is say, now, Mr. Jones, I understand that in 2007, you were convicted of perjury. Is that true? Yes. What happened? Well, I was going through a divorce and I said my income was $1,000 a month and it was actually $4,000 a month. And you get that on the record and you say, do you recognize that was wrong? Yes. Why was it wrong? Well, I lied to a court, and I shouldn't have done that. And I have paid my debt for that. And you get that on the record so that you can establish remorse for having been a liar. What you don't want to have happen is somebody being convicted for lying and then for tax evasion and just generally having the reputation as kind of a sleazy character. Now, Michael Cohen has sort of that reputation generally as sort of a sleazy character. I don't know him well enough to be able to say anything about him, but that has routinely been reported in the media and by people on here who have covered that trial. In that situation where you have somebody like that, sometimes you still have to use them. You'll see this a lot in prisoner cases. And by that, what I mean is somebody gets stabbed to death in a prison and the only people who witnessed it are, convicts and sometimes even convicted perjurers. And they're the people who saw what happened. They have to testify. And you just have to hope that the jury sees that, yeah, they lied about other things, but they didn't lie about this. Well, that is what is at the heart of the Trump matter and the Cohen testimony, because he was convicted of perjury. He was convicted of tax evasion. Now, he claims that he was targeted as in part of a political vendetta aimed at Donald Trump, but be that as it may, he wound up having to plead guilty to having lied under oath and having lied to Congress, and he disclosed all of this during his initial, direct testimony. But oh my goodness, on the cross-examination, he was simply filleted. I should say flayed. Flaying is where somebody essentially peels the skin off of you. He was flayed on cross-examination. He had to admit a number of things that he had been convicted of lying, and that he was caught in a lie in what I would call a My Cousin Vinny grits moment. You may remember in the movie My Cousin Vinny there is a question about how long it took the person to fix their grits. And he says, I'm a Southerner. We take pride in our grits. No self-respecting Southerner eats instant grits. And then he says, well, how can it be that, you were able to cook your grits faster on your stove than anybody else in the grit eating world? And of course, he has to admit, okay, I was probably mistaken about the amount of time. And that is an excellent cross-examination in My Cousin Vinny, and they almost did the same thing on Michael Cohen. What they did was said, you had testified that you had called Trump's bodyguard and that he put President Trump on, and that's where you had this long conversation where you revealed that you had done this for Stormy Daniels. But it turned out that there were other texts and other information at the same time that indicated what he was really talking about was being harassed by a 14-year-old boy and calling the Secret Service for help about prank phone calls. Now, I've looked at the Secret Service's mission, and the Secret Service doesn't do prank phone calls. Cohen's a lawyer. He knows that. What he was doing was trying to get a favor by virtue of hanging on to Donald Trump's coattails. And you do see that a lot too. With famous people, there are always going to be hangers-on. And that's sort of what the right side of Twitter and the right side of YouTube are going to tell you about Michael Cohen. And the left side is going to say, well, Trump hired him and Trump is responsible for what he did. And in addition, he came off as very human and very relatable, and the jury was listening very intently on direct, and they're going to tell you that the cross-examination was rambling, and maybe it was. I don't know. It's very difficult to do a cross-examination in any case, but I'm sure when the former president of the United States is looking over your shoulder, it's probably even harder to do at that point. But what was really interesting is at the end of the day, the things that they got in on cross-examination with respect to Mr. Cohen were that he was a serial perjurer. He was convicted of lying under oath. He lied to Congress. He lied to President Trump. He recorded his phone conversation with President Trump, and that is a bona fide ethical violation in every jurisdiction. You do not ever tape record your client. It's the kind of thing that will get you disbarred in most jurisdictions. Now, of course, Cohen doesn't have to worry about that. He's already been disbarred. But the final nail in the coffin came the last day when he had to admit that he had stolen $60,000 from the Trump Organization. Now, I don't think there is any way that he recovers from any of that and still has any credibility with the jury at the end of the day. I might be wrong, but that's what I think. You'll have to make your own determination based on the reading that you do and the information that you receive. There were a lot of problems with this prosecution from the very beginning, simply because the statute of limitations had run on the misdemeanor, and the only way to bring this case was to make it a felony by stretching federal election law. And of course, it's very well known that federal election law is policed by the Federal Election Commission, and only they have the ability, and the DOJ has the ability to prosecute crimes under the statutes that govern the Federal Election Commission. So, again, I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm just saying that it was a very, very difficult case to make at the beginning. And of course, even if this case falls apart, they've got a case in D.C. against the president and the case down in Florida against the president, and of course the case a few miles from here in Atlanta against the president. So again, it isn't one of those things where this is a complete win for everybody if this case falls apart. It's simply one of four. And we don't know how any of this is actually going to come out in the end. So what I want to point out here is that when the lawyers got ready to do the cross-examination here, they got all of the information they could get from the prosecution. The prosecution has an obligation under Brady to turn over everything that could potentially be exculpatory which apparently they did because the texts that led to that "my cousin Vinny" moment were derived from the prosecution. And the prosecution put up a graph that showed some of those texts, but not the ones that indicated that he was being harassed by a 14-year-old boy, antecedent to the phone call with Schiller, who is the president's bodyguard. So when they got ready to do the cross-examination, they worked in terms of chapters, and that they would take one particular issue that they wanted to impeach him on, and they would go to the record and they would impeach him with everything that happened, and then they would move on. And it was a fairly damning cross-examination. Even CNN and analysts agreed that he didn't have a very good time on cross-examination. Here's what CNN's folks said.
But if I'm a juror, and I've heard, and I've been warned that Michael Cohen lies. The prosecutors have said this. They've set it up. I'm prepared for that. I'm prepared for he's lied in the past repeatedly. I don't know if a juror is prepared for he lied to this jury 2 days ago, but now he's really telling the truth. I mean, I don't know. Does a juror make a difference between, oh yeah, those are his old lies, but he's really now telling the truth?
His appearance may actually have even hurt the case that the DA was bringing in that case. Now, we have to wait and see how all this shakes out. The last witness was a witness by the name of Costello, who came in and said, he told me he didn't have anything on President Trump, that President Trump never did ask him to do anything that was illegal. So there certainly is enough reasonable doubt if the jury decides to acquit. There is a bare minimum of evidence if enough to sustain a conviction. But of course, the jurisdictional issues and everything else are going to be tying this case up in appellate court for a really, really long time. That's what I have for you today. If you have any questions, put them in the comments down below. And as always, you can email me at the address above. I'd love to hear your comments on this because I have been following this. I've been a little reluctant to make a video on it because it could be perceived as me championing Trump, or it could be perceived as me believing that Trump did something wrong. And I don't have either of those two views. I am agnostic on this case. And the reason I am is because this case has a huge jurisdictional issue that I think will ultimately undo anything that happens in it. 10 years from now, it's going to be a blip on the radar screen. That's my analysis, because you don't get to import federal law into state law and run a trial on federal election law violations as part of a bad record-keeping investigation. So we'll just see how that all shakes out. If you have the opportunity today, do something kind for someone, and then come on back down here tomorrow or the next day and catch me down here at the beach, and we'll talk about something else that you'll find interesting. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.